The lights were soft, not glaring, just enough to carve out his silhouette against the black velvet of the studio. He sat still, hands clasped loosely in his lap, head slightly bowed, like a man waiting for something that wasn't entirely clear. Not the next question, not the next fight, something deeper. The room was hushed, the crew barely moved. The air, though quiet, was heavy with reverence, as if everyone present understood that this wasn't just another interview. This was Manny Pacquiao. To many, he is a legend of the ring, a name etched into the history books beside Ali, Tyson, and Mayweather. But before the belts, before the parades and the political office, there was just a boy, barefoot, hungry, and invisible. The man now seated in front of the cameras was forged not in gyms or locker rooms, but in the heat of Manila streets and the emptiness of forgotten nights. He was born Emmanuel Dapidran Pacquiao in Kibawe, Bukidnon, in the heart of the Philippines. A town so small, so distant from the lights of Las Vegas or Macau, that it was rarely found on maps. He was the fourth of 6 children, in a family that had little but faith. Their home was made of thin plywood, and their roof leaked when it rained. On good days there was rice, on bad days there wasn't even that. From the moment he could walk, Manny understood that life wasn't going to offer him anything for free. Every smile had to be earned, every meal fought for. He sold donuts and water on the streets to help his mother, Dionysia. He carried wood, cleaned floors, and slept on cardboard when the nights grew too long. There was no childhood in the traditional sense, no toys, no cartoons, no dreams of vacations, just survival, just noise and dust and the constant gnawing ache of hunger. But there was also a fire, a spark that no one saw but him, something that whispered in the back of his mind, "You were made for more." Boxing found him before he found it. At 12, he started training in General Santos City, where he learned to make his fists say what his voice couldn't. There, under the guidance of trainers who saw something unusual in the wiry kid with oversized gloves, Manny began to transform. He was fast, yes, but it was more than that. He was fierce, relentless, as if he wasn't just punching an opponent, but every injustice he had ever known. Hunger, abandonment, poverty. Every jab was a memory. Every hook, a scar. At 16, he turned pro, not because he was ready, but because he was desperate. He lied about his age to qualify for bouts. He was barely over 100 pounds, thin as a whisper, but he fought grown men without flinching. He won more than he lost, and when he lost, he came back meaner, smarter, hungrier. The rise was not meteoric, it was brutal. It was made of bus rides to distant towns, sleeping in empty gyms, praying he wouldn't get knocked out because he couldn't afford the hospital bill. But he climbed, inch by inch, fight by fight. Then, one day, the world noticed. His knockout of Lelo Ledwaba in 2001 stunned the boxing world. Pacquiao was a replacement fighter, barely known outside Asia. But that night, he danced and roared like destiny itself had wrapped itself around his gloves. HBO called him a tsunami. The rest of the world called him a miracle. Titles followed, 8 divisions in total, something no one had ever done. Not Ali, not Sugar Ray, not even Mayweather. Pacquiao was rewriting boxing history in real time, and he was doing it with a smile that never quite hid the storm inside him. Back home, the Philippines fell in love. They called him the People's Champ, not just because he fought for them, but because he was them. Every victory was a national celebration. The streets would empty during his bouts. Crime rates literally dropped to 0. Churches, bars, and army barracks all turned their eyes to one screen, one ring, one man. He carried not just gloves, but the hopes of an entire archipelago. He was more than a boxer. He was a phenomenon. He recorded songs, starred in films, was elected to Congress and then to the Senate. He built schools, hospitals, and gave away millions, not because it looked good, but because he remembered. He never forgot the boy who once slept under tables, who once ate scraps, who once had only a dog as a friend. And yet, for all his fame, he remained grounded. He trained with monk's discipline. He prayed before every meal. He kissed the floor of the ring before every fight. He greeted janitors and presidents with the same quiet respect. Reporters noted that in a world full of egos, Pacquiao never seemed to believe his own myth, perhaps because he knew how fragile the myth really was, or perhaps because he had seen life from the ground, and no title could make him forget that. And now in this small studio, thousands of miles from Manila, he sat again, not as a champion or a senator, but as a man. The cameras were rolling, the interviewer preparing his notes, but there was no grand entrance, no entourage. Just Pacquiao, in a simple black jacket, sipping tea, waiting. The interviewer cleared his throat, thanked him for coming, and began the formalities. But even in those early moments, something felt different. There was a weight in the air, a sense that this conversation wasn't going to be about punches or pay-per-views. This was something else, something quieter, deeper. The first few questions were easy. They talked about legacy, about training routines, about the fight with Mayweather and the wars with Marquez. Pacquiao answered with calm grace. He smiled often, laughed occasionally. But even as he spoke, his eyes seemed distant, anchored somewhere else, as if he knew what was coming. Because buried in the list of questions was one that had nothing to do with boxing and everything to do with the man behind the gloves. It was a question that no title could shield him from, a question that would strip away the myth and expose the scar that no victory ever healed. But that would come later. For now he sat, calm and composed, as the world once again turned its eyes toward him. The story of Manny Pacquiao had been told 1,000 times, rags to riches, boy to legend. But what few understood was that his greatest fight had never been in the ring. It had been in the silence between punches, in the ache of absence, in the question he never wanted to answer until now. The questions had been flowing, steady as a river, talk of legacy, footwork, speed, strategy, politics, God. All familiar terrain. All part of the carefully drawn constellation that surrounded Manny Pacquiao's life. He answered each one with humility, smiling that familiar smile. The one Filipinos had seen through TVs in dark salas and radios balanced on plastic stools. The one that said everything was okay even when it wasn't. But as the minutes ticked by, something imperceptible began to shift. The air inside the studio felt heavier now, as though the walls themselves knew what was coming. The interviewer, a seasoned professional, took a slow breath, his eyes dipping momentarily to the paper in front of him. And then he asked it, not cruelly, not sensationally, but with the solemn weight it deserved. Manny, have you forgiven your father for what happened when you were a boy? There was no reaction at first, not a word, not a blink. Just a pause so vast it swallowed every sound in the room. Even the lights, constant and humming, seemed to flicker in the silence. Pacquiao's gaze dropped. He didn't speak. His smile faded, not quickly but gradually, like a candle losing its last strength. The transformation in him was not theatrical. It was quiet, profound. His hands, resting on his knees, tightened slightly. You could almost hear the room stop breathing. When he finally looked up, his eyes were not defiant or angry. They were tired. But not the tiredness of age or jet lag. This was something deeper. The exhaustion of carrying a wound that fame could never cauterize. I was 12, he began softly, his voice barely more than a breath. Maybe 13. I don't remember exactly. I just remember the feeling. He didn't look at the interviewer. He stared past him into something the camera couldn't see. His words were slow, deliberate, as though each one had to be pulled up from a place he rarely visited. I had a dog. His name was Onyok. He was the only thing I had. I mean, I had my mother, my siblings, but Onyok was mine. He waited for me every day when I came home from selling bread. He licked my face when I cried. He made me feel like I existed. He paused, swallowed hard. One night I came home, and he was gone. My father, he had killed him, cooked him, ate him. The words hung in the air like a wound left open. No metaphor, no softening. I couldn't believe it. I remember just running. I didn't even know where. I ran until my feet bled. I cried until I had no more voice. That night I slept in the streets. I thought I would never go home again. I thought I would die. He inhaled slowly, shaking his head slightly, not in disbelief, but in memory. That wasn't just a dog. That was everything I had. That was my best friend, my anchor, and it was gone, just like that. The interviewer didn't speak. No one did. Even the cameras seemed to still, as if listening not just with microphones, but with reverence. Pacquiao continued. I hated him. For years. Even after I started boxing, even after I started winning, that moment stayed with me. I didn't trust anyone, not fully. I was angry all the time, but I hid it. I used it. Every punch I threw. It wasn't just for victory. It was to fight back against the world that took him from me. His voice trembled now, the mask slipping further with each sentence. I used to lie awake at night thinking of him. Not my dog, my father. I used to ask God why he would give me a father like that. A man who could do something like that to his own son. He wiped his eye quickly, but it didn't matter. Everyone had seen. The tears had come. For a long time I stopped praying. I was raised Catholic. I was taught to forgive, but I couldn't. I didn't want to. I told myself that if I ever saw him again, I wouldn't shake his hand. I wouldn't even look at him. There was a long silence. He leaned back slightly, breathing deeply, as if to give the truth enough space to land. But people change. Time doesn't heal everything, but it shows you things. As I got older, I realized that my pain had made me strong, yes, but it had also made me cold. I could win fights, but I struggled to let people close. Even my wife, my children. I loved them, but part of me was always guarded, always afraid they'd be taken too. Another pause, another breath. Then one day, many years later, he came to find me. My father. I was already famous by then. He came to one of my fights in General Santos. He didn't try to talk to me. He just stood there behind the crowd watching, and for the first time, I didn't feel anger. I just felt tired. His voice grew quieter, almost to a whisper. I asked to meet him. Just the two of us, no cameras, no press, no bodyguards. We sat on a bench in the park, and for a long time we said nothing, just sat there. Then he started crying. I didn't know what to do. I'd never seen him cry. He looked down again, blinking hard. He said he was sorry, that he had been desperate, that he didn't know how else to feed us, that he hated himself for what he did. And for the first time, I didn't want revenge. I didn't want an apology. I just wanted peace. He turned his head slowly toward the interviewer, locking eyes for the first time in minutes. So, I forgave him. Not because he deserved it, but because I didn't want to carry that weight anymore. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Forgiveness, it's not a weakness, it's not forgetting, it's freedom. I had beaten champions, survived wars in the ring, but forgiving my father, that was the hardest fight of my life. The room was utterly still. Pacquiao smiled then, small, weary, real. People see the belts, the wins, the glory, but they don't know what it cost. Every time I stepped into the ring, I was fighting more than a man. I was fighting history, memory, myself. He let the silence breathe. There was nothing more to say, nothing more needed. That single moment, raw, unscripted, had peeled back every layer of mythology and exposed a truth far greater than any statistic or highlight reel. It wasn't about titles. It wasn't even about redemption. It was about a boy who lost everything and the man who decided to forgive anyway. And in that silence, no one moved. Because everyone understood, this was not the story of a boxer. This was the story of a human being who, against every odd, chose grace over bitterness, and in doing so, reminded everyone watching that even the deepest wounds can carry light. The studio lights seemed softer now, as if dimmed by the weight of what had just been spoken. No one had planned for this moment, not the producers, not the crew, not the interviewer, and certainly not Pacquiao. And yet there it was. A silence so full it could barely hold itself, filled not with tension but with reverence. It was the kind of silence that didn't beg to be broken, the kind that said, "This matters, don't look away." Pacquiao remained still, not frozen but thoughtful, the kind of stillness that only comes after the storm has passed, Not because the sky is clear, but because the soul is tired. His hands were once again folded loosely on his lap. His eyes, red but resolute, stared somewhere in the middle distance. He wasn't in the studio anymore. He was far away, back in the streets of General Santos, back on that park bench with a man he once swore he'd never speak to again, back in the very heart of what had made him who he was. The interviewer leaned forward just slightly, not to probe further, but simply to be closer to the gravity of what was being shared. He spoke gently, as if entering sacred space. "Did you ever rebuild that relationship?" he asked. Pacquiao nodded slowly, not with excitement but with something quieter. Acceptance. Peace. "We're not close," he said. "Not like father and son in the movies. We don't talk often. We don't laugh over old stories, but we respect each other now. We acknowledge each other, and that's more than I ever thought possible." He paused, letting the weight of that land before continuing. "He's met my children. He came to my home once for Christmas. I invited him. My wife cooked. It was strange seeing him there. I watched him watching them, my kids, my life. I think that was the first time he understood what he had missed." There was a beat of silence. "He cried when he left, not because of regret, but because I think he finally saw that the boy he hurt didn't stay broken." The interviewer said nothing. The truth had been spoken plainly, and with truths like this, silence was the only fitting response. Pacquiao exhaled deeply and leaned forward just slightly, as if coming back to the room, back to the moment. "People always ask me, what's the hardest fight you ever had? They expect me to say Mayweather, or Morales, or Marquez. And those were wars. But they were fair fights. Two men, gloves on, rules in place." He tilted his head slightly, voice dropping into something more personal. "But life doesn't fight fair. Life hits when you're a child, when you don't know how to defend yourself, when the person who's supposed to protect you becomes the one you fear. That's the hardest fight, the one with no referee, no bell to save you, no coach in your corner." There was a silence that followed, heavy and human. "I used to think I fought to escape my past," he said. "Now I know I fought to make peace with it." He looked up at the interviewer again, eyes clearer now, voice steadier. "Forgiveness didn't make me weak. It made me free. I let go of that pain, not because it stopped hurting, but because I refused to let it define me anymore." The words hung in the air like scripture, and something in the room shifted. It was subtle, but it was real. The crew, once distant professionals, now watched with the eyes of people who had seen something sacred. The cameraman had tears on his cheek. One of the assistants quietly covered her mouth. These were people who had been around celebrities, athletes, politicians. But this was different. This was not image, not branding. This was a man laying down the last weapon he had ever carried. And then, gently, the interviewer brought them back. "Do you ever miss him?" he asked. There was no need to explain who he meant. Not the father, the dog. Pacquiao smiled then, unexpectedly wide. His face opened up in a way it hadn't throughout the entire interview. "Every day," he said. "You don't forget your first friend, especially when that friend loved you without condition." He paused and then added, "I named one of my children Emmanuel Jr., but if I had a dog today, I'd name him Onyok again." The smile lingered, not to hide pain, but to honor memory. As the interview came to a close, the mood didn't lift. It deepened. There was no applause, no grand conclusion, just a shared understanding among everyone present that they had witnessed something rare. Not greatness in victory, but greatness in vulnerability. Pacquiao stood slowly, removing the lapel microphone from his jacket with gentle fingers. He handed it to the technician with a nod. The room was still quiet, not from discomfort, but from awe. No one quite knew how to say goodbye after something like that. He looked around once, meeting the eyes of everyone in the room, and then, before walking out, he turned back to the interviewer. "Thank you for asking," he said softly. "Most people don't." And with that, he walked out of frame. The shot lingered on the empty chair. For a moment, it was just furniture in a room, but in the echo of that absence, you could feel the magnitude of what had just been left behind. Not just a story, but a confession. Not just a legend, but a man. Outside, the sky was beginning to darken. In the streets of cities thousands of miles away, kids still carried gloves too big for their hands, dreaming of the man who rose from nothing. In gyms from Quezon City to Los Angeles, young fighters trained to be like Pacquiao, not just to hit harder, but to stand taller. But none of them, not one, could truly understand what it had cost. In the ring, Manny Pacquiao had been a warrior. On the stage of politics, a servant. In the eyes of his people, a hero. But in the quiet of that studio, in front of a single question and the courage to answer it, he had been something far more enduring. Human. And in that humanity, he had delivered his most powerful punch, not with his fists but with his heart.